listeners. We're pleased to welcome you to our Chair Chat. And our Chair Chat is now with our new chair, our incoming chair, Mario Sullivan. This is brought to you by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. And this chat is part of CRSJ's commitment to highlighting and sharing updates on key civil rights and human rights issues through accessible public programming. To learn more about upcoming events, on-demand programming, and other resources, visit our website, americanbar.org/CRSJ, or the easy way is just Google ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice. I'm your moderator. My name is Francine Lipman, and I am very fortunate to be the chair of the editorial board of the Human Rights Magazine. That is the award-winning flagship journal of ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice. And if you're a member, you get all 4 issues. Although last year we went into overtime because so much was going on, and we published 6 issues. I'm a William S. Boyd Professor of Law at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, at the William S. Boyd School of Law. And I'm going to start this conversation with something that we're really hitting on hard this year, and that is the 60th year anniversary of ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice. And then I'm going to specifically talk about the economic justice tax resolution, because if you didn't know this, I am a tax law professor and I'm an out of the closet tax nerd. And I've joined together today with a panel of tax experts, historians, and I would say that they're pretty much out of the closet as well, being tax mavens, mentions, and nerds. So it's hard to believe, because all of us are aging like fine wines, I know I am, that the ABA started 147 years ago. Seems like yesterday. In 1878. 75 lawyers from 20 states in Washington, D.C. met in New York, AJ, and to establish the ABA. It took a long time to get the first woman. The first woman member didn't start to 1918. But what about ABA civil rights and social justice? Well, telling this story always gives me goosebumps because it's part of our history and your history. In 1963, the then president, John F. Kennedy, remember Camelot? It was a different time. It was the civil rights movement. This was before the voting right acts. And President Kennedy, together with his brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, wanted lawyers to get involved. They were very frustrated that lawyers were not engaged with the civil rights movement. They weren't organizing. They weren't pushing people to do better and to represent these individuals who were on the front line. So they called to the White House in 1963, the summer of 63, 244 lawyers in the East Room of the White House. And they charged these individuals, where's an organized bar? You folks need to step up to the plate. And the good news is they did. A myriad of different organizations were created as a result of that meeting. There were 244 lawyers there who were from throughout the United States and every state of the Union and Washington, D.C., including 50 Black lawyers. The ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section didn't start until a couple years later. The section started with the name Individual Rights and Responsibilities. So that was the original name. And then in 2015, it was renamed as ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice. And today, it is a vibrant organization, part of the ABA. ABA, by the way, has about 200,000 lawyers. Not quite that many in civil rights and social justice. But at this moment in time, I can tell you it is a critical turning point for ABA civil rights and social justice. Frankly, we have been the target of a lot of pushback and funding cuts and a myriad of other issues that we're fighting on the front lines, frankly, every single day. And economic justice is part of that conversation. And specifically today, we're going to talk about tax justice because taxpayer rights are human rights. The ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Economic Justice section, which is where the tax lawyers hang out, in case you were wondering, they have a bunch of resolutions, and I'm just going to talk briefly about two. And these resolutions are charges to the big ABA and to all the lawyers across the country, and specifically the federal government, saying, we, the lawyers, want to support and tell you we want that. For example, the most recent one, menstrual products should not be subject to sales tax. Now, obviously, the federal government doesn't have a sales tax, but just putting this out there and asking the federal government to support this position. Similarly, in 2023, there was a charge that the federal government should provide some sort of renter's credit. Because as we know through our federal income tax system, we support and subsidize, to a lesser extent actually now, home ownership as part of this American dream. But renters are not similarly supported. In some states they are, including to some modest extent, California, but charging the federal government was supporting housing. Too many people now cannot afford home ownership, and so supporting tenants through a myriad of renters credits and child credits so that kids can be in safe housing, etc. And this is part of a real pushback against people who are unhoused, etc. But let's move on and talk to our two exceptional panelists. We are really honored. I was kind of shocked when they both said yes, because my sense is maybe they aren't both on panels because they bring to the table such a rich background in tax history. And just listening to me talk about these historical moments, I hope it got you in the mood to listen to historians. I love history because it's storytelling, and it's our stories, our history. So first we have Dr. Mehrotra, and he is the Stanford Clinton Senior and Zylpha Kilbride Clinton Research Professor of Law at the Northwestern Pritzer School of Law. He's also an affiliate professor with the Department of History. So he's a historian, he's a lawyer, and a tax person, all in one fabulous package. But many of us know him for his incredible work with the American Bar Foundation, which is an independent nonprofit research institute. I know he gets asked that a lot, that focuses on empirical and interdisciplinary study of law. So he was the executive director for many years, and now he has stepped down. He's a research professor there. And this year, he is very fortunate to be in a city we all love, New York City, as a visiting scholar with the Russell Sage Foundation. And our two panelists are prolific scholars. They have many books between them. And Joe Thorndike is actually a second generation author, book author, with a father who has some really interesting pieces as well. So Dr. Mehrotra, his books include The New Fiscal Sociology, Taxation in Comparative and Historical Perspectives. And more recently, he's a co-editor with Larry Zelnak, A Half Century with the Internal Revenue Code, The Memoirs of Stanley Surrey. Now, our other panelist is Joseph J. Thorndike. He is a junior, but doesn't use that because his dad is actually just as impressive and he stands on his shoulders. Joe's a nationally recognized historian of U.S. fiscal and economic policy. He serves as the director of the Tax History Project at Tax Analysts. If you ever are on the Tax Analysts website or read any of their publications, Joe is prolific, front and center, and he has been there, talk about history, since 1987, when he was just a, a Doogie Howser intern, and he later worked as a congressional reporter and a deputy editor in chief. He's written several books, Their Fair Share, Taxing the Rich in the Age of FDR, War and Taxes. He's a co-author and another co-author of a book that kind of resonates with our conversation today, and that is Tax Justice, the Ongoing Debate. Will we ever get to the end of that debate? I'm not sure we will. Both of them have written for all the high-profile magazines and law reviews and national publications. You'll hear their voices on NPR, et cetera, et cetera. So loud applause. This is how we clap in cyberspace for our wonderful panelists. And did I miss any high point you want to bring to my attention about your phenomenal backgrounds?
I think you got it all.
Thank you.
The
Very generous introduction, Francine. Thank you very much.
The whole enchilada. So I've got a list of questions and I'm going to ask them. And then I actually ask these brilliant minds, these co-panelists, to ask a question of each other. And so they'll do that, and then we'll wrap this up. We don't have enough time with you, but the chair chats are supposed to be a little bit truncated. It's a chat. It's not a lecture, but let's get started. Okay, Joe, given the rich history and focus of ABA civil rights and social justice, so think about that, 60 years on the front lines, including economic justice and tax justice, among many other issues. What might be some highs and low points in tax history since 1966?
So that is a complicated question. So it's a little hard for me to come up with the high points, and I'm not necessarily negative in general, but I don't necessarily have a lot of high points that I would choose since the 1960s. There are some expansions of certain progressive tax credits have been important, and I do think that even the great tax reform effort in 1986 was important for different reasons. But most of what we have today in terms of the federal tax system really was created during World War II, and there have been many changes since then. I wouldn't necessarily count all of them as improvements, but we still have mostly the same system. That becomes less true every year, but mostly the same system that they put together during World War II at the end of the New Deal era, essentially. Um, Let me talk about the low points because they are more evident to me. So I think that there has been a gradual sort of delegitimization of high-end progressivity. By that I mean the way that we tax wealth in this country. Maybe the most direct sense would be, say, the evisceration of the estate tax since roughly the year 2000 or so. Um, but also just the abandonment of sort of high rates in high brackets. And there are reasons why high rates are a problem and why a proliferation of brackets might be a problem, although I'm less convinced of that. But we've lost something in the process. We've lost some sense of proportionality, honestly, in that uh, we don't there has been an enormous concentration of wealth in this country and also around the world, but especially in this country. And yet the tax system does not really take much account of that anymore. And our top bracket begins well below the sort of upper stratosphere of American wealth now. So it isn't really even a tax for extremely rich people. For the billionaires of the world, it's a tax for sort of regular rich people and everyone above them. So that's one. I think that um, we have fetishized efficiency in the construction of the tax system, which is an appropriate goal a lot of the time, but we've lost track of other standards of good tax policy, things that aren't measured as well as efficiency, things like fairness. And I think that our failure to really account for those in the tax policy process in any kind of reasonably serious way has been a real loss over time, and corrosive of the nation's political institutions as well as its tax institutions, I think. Another one would be, and this one's a little counterintuitive maybe, the erosion of revenue adequacy is something that actually anyone cares about. Now, it's often popular on the left to not care very much about revenue adequacy either, say the deficits don't matter. But I think that setting aside whatever economic arguments there might be about that, it's what we've ended up with is a continual drive to cut taxes with no limitations on that drive over time, or just reduced limitations over and over again. So essentially, decisions are less hard than they used to be. And that leads to lots of bad decisions. I think that there's a discipline to having to not, if not balance the books, at least pay attention to fiscal sustainability over the long term. And the erosion of that standard has led us to make to a sort of pell-mell rush toward tax reduction. Because the little apologies to Mick Jagger here, the real in tax now you can always get what you want almost, because we just cut taxes whenever we feel like it, and I think that has produced some really quite bad policy over time. So those are my depressing bad moments. I'd be interested to hear what Ajay has to say, and if he has anything better to say, anything happier to say.
Well, first let me say thank you to Francine, Ali, and everyone at the ABA section on civil rights and social justice. I remember working with lots of folks, not only at the ABA, but throughout the sections as my time at the foundation. And so I'm honored to be here with my good friend and colleague Joe. And so thanks to Francine for the invitation. And I agree with Joe. Joe and I often agree on a lot of these issues as historians. I mean, you can't really talk about the history of economic justice and tax justice and not notice all the ways in which some of the progressive ideals of a much earlier generation are being undermined in the last 40 or 50 years. And so I completely agree with Joe. I will just add on the sort of state and local side of the lows, we've seen how the property tax has been a tool of dispossession, often racial inequality that's come about. There's been some terrific work by scholars, Andrew Carl's recent book, which I know Joe is also a fan of, our friend Dorothy Brown's work. Really, so tax has always been about more than just revenue. It's always been about, or at least it's attempted to be about fairness, and it's been undermined in recent years, that the equity element of it. But I think most people understand, and I'm sure people who are active in this section know that taxation is also about social control. It's about political power. And so we see a lot of those lows that Joe is talking about across the board in tax policy. I am an optimist, so I try to identify some highs in the last 50 or 60 years. I mean, it is also because of tax law and policy that we have things like Medicare and Medicaid, right? So the Great Society expansions, where it's not particularly tax law, it's fiscal policy writ large, but we have the limited social uh, welfare safety net we have in the United States is supported by tax policy and the spending. And if you go back to the height of the civil rights movement, when the section was founded, as Francine pointed out, I mean, it was Martin Luther King, after all, who linked racial justice with economic justice very famously, right? Arguing that fair tax policy was sort of essential to combating poverty and inequality. And so there are glimmers of hope. I tend to agree with Joe that the last 40 or 50 years has been one about an assault on our progressive tax system, but there are elements that we can look to for some optimism. I'll also include in there the earned income tax credit, which is a major tax expenditure and arguably the most robust form of social welfare spending in the United States. It's been documented that it's a very robust anti-poverty program, and that's done through the tax system, right? So we need to keep in mind all the ways in which the U.S. tax system operates to address economic justice.
Amen. And so what's interesting is just talking about tax justice, already you highlight the biggest anti-poverty programs in our country right now, which is Social Security. Lifts more than 27 million people, including children, out of poverty every year. And the second one really is the earned income tax credit combined with the child tax credit. And so those social policies certainly are economic justice policies. But Joe is right in that our highest marginal tax rates are historically very low at 37%, and it doesn't kick in until $750,000 for married filing joint, and it's the dollars above that. And there is no millionaire tax, despite what buzz it gets. Ajay, what do you believe is the biggest threat to tax justice today and in the near term? We're seeing so many threats on so many different fronts. What about tax justice?
Well, I mean, I think currently one of the biggest threats is certainly the way we're dismantling the Internal Revenue Service. And this has been an ongoing issue with funding cuts over time. But as I'm sure everyone knows, the current presidential administration is doing much more than that. That not only have the initial funding been clawed back recently, but there have been additional cuts. There's hiring freezes. There's no stability of leadership at the IRS, and I think Joe would agree that the assessment process, the collection mechanism, is absolutely critical to making sure we have a fair and effective tax system. And if we are going to implement social welfare policy through tax expenditures like the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, that's also through the IRS. So it's on both ends. We're not collecting as much as we can from the top end of folks who ought to be paying their fair share. And if we're going to undermine our administrative structure, we're also not going to help the people on the low end through which the tax expenditures is aimed at. So I think that's the biggest threat right now.
Can I just add to that? Also, at the IRS, I think that there's a real assault taking shape on taxpayer privacy right now, and that we used to be able to take for granted that information that we provided to the IRS or that the IRS collected about us would be protected from dissemination and disclosure. And there have always been provisions that have allowed the IRS to share information with other government agencies under certain circumstances, but they were limited. And those limits are being removed currently. And consequently, I think saying that we're weaponizing that information is an overstatement, but we are really undermining the tax administration system that we have when we remove those protections. Because if people don't feel that they can be honest with the IRS about their data and that data will be protected, they will not be as honest, and the tax system won't work as well. So I think people have an inherent right to privacy anyway, but it's also, practically speaking, a disaster for the tax system to undermine that taxpayer privacy, and to the extent that we are right now.
And we're actually seeing that in certain communities where tax compliance is suffering. It's not happening. And recently there was a FOIA request showing that ICE had requested over 1 million names and addresses of the IRS. Now, the IRS only responded to 38,000 because they complied. But again, that is, as Joe said, breaking this trust and this long-standing sense of security, and breaking that causes a chilling effect that we're seeing today.
Mhm.
And by the way, we are on, I think, our 8th IRS commissioner this year.
Yeah.
And it is actually the Secretary of the Treasury who's currently the IRS commissioner.
Right.
Yes. So, all
Yeah.
right, Joe, I'm going to give you a magic wand. I only have a few of them, so use it wisely. What tax policy, provision, or administrative rule would you implement or erase from being implemented, and why?
So mine is a sort of like probably a pie in the sky answer to that question, because I'm going to suggest that we get rid of something which has been almost without exception a feature of the income tax since the very beginning, which is the preference for capital gains. Um, it is almost as old as the income tax. Well, it is as old as the income tax. It did disappear briefly, very briefly, in the 1980s as a result of the great tax reform in 1986, but it came right back. And there are arguments to be made for taxing capital gains at a different rate. But the reality of it is, especially in a world where income and wealth inequality has been growing at an unbelievable pace for decades now, really, the capital gains preference adds to those problems. And it allows taxpayers, especially wealthy taxpayers, to dramatically reduce their tax liability in ways that simply aren't available to taxpayers who don't have a lot of capital gains, or who can't, for that matter, manage to recast their regular income as somehow suddenly capital gains, as I would say I think some people do on Wall Street. The existence of the capital gains preference, it isn't bad just because it reduces rates for rich people. It also encourages a lot of sort of tax shenanigans, because it opens the door to creativity among the tax bar. um, and I think that a lot of the complexity in the tax system, a lot of the tax avoidance that goes on, is a direct result of the existence of this preference for capital gains relative to regular labor income. This has always been a problem. It's becoming a bigger and bigger problem. I think you could solve a lot of problems and raise a lot of revenue by simply eliminating the preference for capital gains, which, it's worth saying, Ronald Reagan agreed to in 1986. So, I mean, Reagan was incentivized through a giant rate reduction, but nonetheless, it was an important concession, I think, to tax fairness, that Reagan made. And it's unfortunate it didn't last. That would be my magic wand answer.
Amen. And it's interesting because I know the state of California doesn't have a capital gain tax preference. Nevada doesn't have a income tax, but what about New York? Does New York have a capital gain tax preference?
I
I
don't
don't know the
know.
answer to that.
I
Yeah.
don't know the answer. I would just add as a friendly footnote to Joe's point about the 86 Act is for that, it was a relatively short period, but the sky did not fall. You know, it's not as if equity markets fell apart and investment just stopped. And so then a lot of the traditional or conventional rationales or justifications for having the capital gains tax preference, I don't think are very empirically sound. And so we've at least seen in the short period after the 86 Act, when the preference was repealed, that things went on and the American economy did not fall apart. And so I agree with Joe that it's probably not likely, especially given our current anti-tax culture that we're in now. But I think that's one thing that ought to come back as well.
Exactly. And Wall Street doesn't seem to be suffering now. The Dow, the Nasdaq, and the S&P are soaring, and a lot of the wealth inequality is because of this stock investment. Ownership is just rocket for the billionaire boys. All right. I will take back my magic wand, please. Um, Okay, Ajay, why isn't there a book on the history of no US VAT? Most of the world has a VAT. US doesn't have one. And when are you going to take this critical tax project on?
Thank you for that question, Francine. That's currently my research project. I'm trying to figure out why is it that the United States is the only advanced industrial society without any kind of broad-based national consumption tax? And then what does that tell us? What does that absence tell us about the sources and nature of economic inequality in America? I mean, if you look at all the countries and like the vast majority of countries now, and certainly all the OECD countries, have some kind of a broad-based national consumption tax, whether it's a VAT, sometimes it's called a goods and services tax, as it is in Australia, for example. But these are broad-based sale. They're essentially sales taxes. The incidence falls on the consumer, so they're very similar to a national sales tax. And what they do in most other countries is provide for some very robust social welfare spending. So you can actually support national health care, national education, old age pensions, and the like with a robust tax like that. And even if you don't believe that the United States ought to have European style social welfare state, have a looming fiscal crisis given our already entitlement spending commitments, right? Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, right? We have no choice but to find revenue. And for the last, to going back to Joe's earlier point, for the last 40 or plus years, revenue has not been much of a concern. And it will have to be a concern at some point. And I'm trying to figure out historically what were the moments when the United States could have adopted some kind of crude form of national broad-based consumption tax that might have evolved into a VAT. I'm not suggesting that we're going to have a VAT tomorrow, but I think it's important. History can provide important policy lessons for today, and hopefully we can identify, if I ever get this project completed, try to identify what some of the factors are in the United States, historical factors that are still with us today that have inhibited us from thinking about broad-based national consumption taxes.
Interesting. And with the tsunami of seniors that are coming on the scene, including the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section, which is, getting to that qualifying for Social Security age, we need revenue.
Absolutely.
I think that and I think Ajay has sort of hinted at this too. Social Security is the point of comparison here, right? It's sort of like a cousin of a VAT in the sense that it's a generally regressive tax being used to finance a very progressive spending program. And I think most people on the left would feel like that was a bargain well made. in 1936. It was controversial in 1936 too. I mean, many of Franklin Roosevelt's advisors thought it was crazy. And if you're going to try to help old people out of poverty, the last thing you should do is be taxing to support that program with a regressive tax. But it actually worked. It worked remarkably well. It's proven very durable. I think this is an insight that the left should take more seriously today. Is a lot of resistance to value-added taxes on the left because they tend to be regressive, and I think that is short-sighted. Their regressivity is not up for debate. They certainly are, but the real question here is what kind of government do we want, even more than what sort of tax system do we want? And if we want progressive spending programs, the lesson from the rest of the world would seem to be that regressive taxes are necessarily a part of that. They're not the only part. They can be supplemented. And this is what Franklin Roosevelt did, is he imposed a very regressive tax to support Social Security, but also imposed or got Congress to impose very progressive taxes on income to balance that out. That sort of a bargain is, I think, a good bargain for progressives today.
And certainly Social Security is a program that people just rely on dramatically across the country, increasingly so as our population ages. And the thought, it's interesting to talk to as an academic, talking to young people who somehow think it's not going to exist, but yet will rely on it heavily as they increasingly don't have retirement plans that are risk-free, et cetera, and they're living longer and healthcare is more expensive. So it will be interesting to think about how to fund all of this. Um, all right, Joe, what's the most important insight or lesson learned that you've taken away from tax history that we, the people, need to hear and embrace, and that maybe some non-tax people it might resonate with them, but they might not think about it?
So I think that it's in many ways what I think is that there's a myth about Americans and taxes, that Americans hate paying taxes. Um, so on some level, not a myth, right? People do hate paying taxes, but that is a universal truth, more or less. A forced government extraction is not popular in the United States. It's not popular in any other country either. So I think to say Americans hate taxes is not to really move the ball very far. That's just a truism. But Americans do not uniquely hate taxes. That's not, I think if the argument here is that we need to be a low tax country because we are by nature and culture and whatever else and history a low tax country, that's just simply not true, I don't think. I think if there's one thing that Americans hate, it's not paying taxes, it's other people not paying the taxes that they legitimately owe. So I see tax avoidance as a sort of unifying theme in American tax history. In almost every during almost every crucial period at the inflection points in American fiscal history, outrage about tax avoidance has been a very powerful lever of reform. And I think that's true even today. So there's two ways to look at it. That kind of outrage can be a lever to produce reform. It can be useful to get changes done, accomplished that we need. On the other hand, a failure to address tax avoidance, legal tax avoidance, also undermines faith in the tax system itself and in government institutions themselves. So I know Ajay has written extensively about the concept of fiscal citizenship, and that is that sort of notion that we are, in addition to being citizens in a political sense, we are citizens in a fiscal sense. We owe something to the state owes something back to us. That element of citizenship, that fiscal component of citizenship, that sustains our institutions in important ways. And when it is undermined, those institutions are threatened. I think that happens right now. I think it's happened at many points in the past. And I think we need to pay attention to that, to make sure that we do not continually undermine those bonds of community, those bonds of citizenship. That's what I think tax avoidance does. That's what I think unaddressed tax avoidance does. And I really want to stress over and over, we're not talking about tax evasion, we're not talking about cheating here, but the sort of consistent, persistent failure to deal with legal tax versions of forms of tax avoidance, like the capital gains preference and all the strange ways that it's exploited. I think that's really dangerous to the tax system, but also to the country as a whole, to our political institutions.
Hmm. Ajay, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, as usual, Joe and I agree on a lot of this stuff, and I think he's absolutely right. But by not enforcing the tax laws effectively, you're undermining tax morale. No one wants to be the sucker, right? Everyone wants to make sure that everyone's paying their fair share, and I think throughout American history, there's lots of public opinion poll data that shows that that's the case, and that also that actually Americans don't mind paying taxes when they see what the benefits are for. And again, as Joe has mentioned and as Joe has written, Social Security is the classic example, right? You see that when there's a tangible benefit to what your taxes are doing, there's usually a lot of support for it, especially during moments of crisis. Joe's written a lot about wars and taxes, and during these kinds of national emergencies, there's a rally around the flag effect in which people want to pay taxes. But outside of those crisis moments, it is really important to maintain notions of fiscal citizenship, and that means the state doing its part to make sure everyone is paying their fair share.
Amen. And huh, there's so much here to unpack, right? We need a whole day to chat about these things. But Joe, I'm going to now let you ask a question of Ajay. Um, he's thought about this long and hard, so put your thinking cap on.
All right. Well, I'm going to come back to this question of the value-added tax because I do believe that, and I mean, this has emerged here as a theme in this conversation already,
Mhm.
but changes are coming, right? Like there's going to be there is some sort of fiscal reckoning that is coming. We know none of us know when it's going to happen, but we can be reasonably certain that as I forget who it was in the Clinton administration that said, I think it was James Carville when he died, he wanted to be reincarnated as the bond market because everyone was
Right.
afraid of the bond market. Well, I mean, the bond market's already making noises that I think will only grow worse over time. We're going to need to do something. And so, is the value added tax, Ajay, the answer to this problem, to our looming fiscal problems? And with full cognizance of how we have oddly ended up not developed one yet. Is it the answer?
Yeah, great question, Joe. But as you know, as historians, we study a lot of periods, but the future ain't one of them. And so I'm not sure I'm not sure or most historians have an answer about what's going to happen. I do think though that there's going to be a moment of fiscal reckoning, as you put it, and I do think when we come to that moment of crisis, and this goes back to something that we've talked about in this conversation that Joe has written quite eloquently about, is that we only get fundamental tax reform or fundamental fiscal reform when we have to have it, not when we want it, right? When our backs are up against the wall and there's a true crisis, that's when fundamental change occurs. And so maybe given where we're going, I mean, the most recent tax legislation, both the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and even the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, is just making budget deficits worse. Right? We're talking trillions of dollars worse, and so there is going to be a moment when something has to happen. Now, one could make the argument, as someone did in a New York Times op-ed not long ago, about how indirectly the Republicans are sending us into this crisis moment where we might actually have a broad-based national consumption tax. I'm not convinced that's going to be the first solution that policymakers turn to, but there's certainly going to be something at some point.
Stay tuned. Right? Stay tuned. Okay, Ajay, you have an opportunity to ask Joe a question.
Well, I think Joe's pointed out a couple of really great things about how tax is not just about raising revenue. It's also in his comments about how the current American political left ought to think more broadly. So I know he's thought about fiscal policy and the Treasury Department, and so I know he's been thinking about and working on a book about the Treasury Department. So I wonder if Joe can tell us what he thinks about the broader view of not just tax law and economic justice, but sort of fiscal policy and the role of the Treasury Department kind of writ large in the past and in our current moment.
Well, I think a Treasury Department that is suitably motivated and well staffed and public minded can accomplish great things. And that is really how we can explain the development of our current tax system during World War II, which is very much a product of sort of deep thinking in the Treasury Department and leadership from Treasury experts and Treasury political appointees at a crucial moment in US history. And I think that we're going to need that kind of leadership again, because there will, as we have said now several times, there will come a moment when the long-term fiscal trajectory is grim enough that we are no longer able to sell our debt readily in public markets, and something will need to be done, and we will need to rely on the good ideas of dispassionate experts in that moment. And politics is all about partisanship now. And to be honest, it's always been about partisanship. And it's not like Republicans were happy with almost anything that happened under Franklin Roosevelt. But we are going to need some deep thinkers and some serious thinkers to help us find our way out of this. Because whether it's a value added tax or something else, it's not going to come exclusively by cutting the spending side of the budget. We're going to need creative thinking on the tax side of the budget to figure out how we're going to get ourselves out of this. Because we've been worried about deficits for a long time. We've been worried about debt for a long time, but we are really entering a new era, and it is going to take true leadership in the Treasury and elsewhere to get us out of this in the not, I think now, probably not so distant future.
How long? Joe.
Yeah, now it's really a question a historian can't answer. But I will say that it seems much more imminent to me now than it did 5 years ago or 10 years ago, because again, we just keep, increasing the spending and driving down the tax revenues. It's simply not sustainable.
Hmm. On that note, stay tuned, everyone, and we have to call this to a close. So thank you to our incredible panelists for sharing their insights. If you found today's program valuable, we invite you to share today's recording with your networks, push it out broadly, and explore other upcoming programs at ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice. Stay connected with our work and help shape the future of civil rights and human rights advocacy. Join us. We're a bargain. $45 and you get all 4 issues of the Human Rights Magazine. We look forward to continuing our work on the front lines. Thank you again. Loud applause to our panelists. Keep in touch, taxpayers.